Welcome to the Wolf and Bull podcast. I'm your host, the Wolf, and I have my co-host, the Bull, sitting across from me. And I keep forgetting to do this, but my sound is this, and your sound is a deer.
Haven't changed.
Haven't changed it. Haven't changed it at all.
Bull.
Yeah, haven't changed it at all. Yeah, it sounds great.
We need a better bull sound than that.
Do we need a better bull sound? Because the only ones I found were moo, which is not a bull sound.
Moo
That's a
will
cow.
not work.
Across from me is the bull. And today we have a special guest, Professor Mark Joslyn. He is the professor of political science at the University of Kansas, author of over 50 journal articles, and author of the intriguing and impactful book, The Gun Gap, The Influence of Gun Ownership on Political Behavior and Attitudes. Welcome to the show, Professor Joslyn.
Thank you, Wolf and Bull. It's nice to be here. And I guess I'm in the Wolf and Beowulf den.
The den, yeah,
That's
the
right.
den.
It's
Yeah,
in the den.
yeah. It's the
Dungeon.
The scientific
Not the dungeon.
reference.
It would be a bad thing to be in a dungeon.
And before we get started, just a quick reminder to our listeners, if you like what you hear, make sure to follow us on Instagram for the latest updates, and a subscription on YouTube would be fantastic. And make sure to give us a 5-star review on any of the major listening platforms. We are also making waves on TikTok, so you can find us there as well. But how is everyone doing? Good?
I'm doing great.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's early in the day. I've
Not your bedtime yet?
No, I haven't had to take a bull nap yet. So I'm doing quite well. How about you over there, Professor Johnson?
I have not taken a nap yet either.
That's very good. You know, there's certain age category. You know what though? There is, I'll never forget this. This was, I don't know, 30 years ago or something like that. I went into an appointment. I was still young in the sales department. 30? No, okay, 40 years ago. Anyways, I was still young in the sales department with this company I was working for, and I went into this office, and the person I was supposed to meet up with wasn't there. And I asked the secretary, "Where is this guy? He's late for his appointment." "Oh, he'll be out in like 5 minutes." And I said, "Why are you whispering?" He goes, she pointed over this way, and there was this little office meeting area over there, and I peeked my head around the corner, and there's a guy laying on the conference table asleep. Not slumped over the conference table, actually laying on top of the conference table.
How did you know he was asleep? He came in dead.
Well, I was worried. I mean, he didn't have his hands over his chest, and he was asleep. He was taking a power nap. And I thought, all these old people, man, they take power naps. What is that about?
Yeah, you had a millennial thought.
You know what's such a good thing is to take a power nap, man. 15 minutes, boom.
This happened, a similar story. When I was in grad school, my dissertation advisor, and he wouldn't mind me talking about him in this regard. He, when I first met him, they told me, "Go upstairs. There's this guy upstairs. You need to talk to him about your project." And so I go upstairs and I knock on his door. There was no answer, but the door was just ajar. And so I peeked in there, and there he is. He's just flat out on his, he had a third row of his van that he had pulled out. He took up in his office, and he sat down, and every day he'd take a nap from 12 to 1. And so after he invited me in and he kind of groggy woke up, as we got to know each other for longer periods of time, I came back to that story. I said, why do you sleep at 12 to 1 every day? I was in the Navy, evidently. He was in the Navy, and he went on the long ship trips. He 12 to 1 every day, and he never got out of that habit, 12 to 1 every day. So
wow. But the question I would have asked, and I'm sure you probably did, was why did he use the back seat of a van as his couch in the office?
That's a longer story.
I'm not sure we want to hear that
His
one.
couch, home.
Yeah, exactly. There were some other issues going on that we will not discuss.
Yeah, well, should I get into the monologue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'll make this really quick, nice and concise, as I normally do.
Oh boy, maybe I can get that power nap in right now,
just
right?
go ahead and fall asleep. America is an incredibly dangerous country. We have data of every sort to convince you that at any given point, you could arrive in the afterlife. Wait, no, that's not right. 3 in 10 U.S. adults are now religiously unaffiliated. Let me start over. America is an incredibly dangerous country. We have data of every sort to convince you that at any given point, you could end up deceased, ending your lineage and legacy, resulting in a complete nothing burger when your shot could have been a verified Kobe Bryant three-pointer. With most causes of death being health-related ailments, almost all of them have sugar intake-related causes. You'd think that the FDA and the CDC would be concerned about what sugar is doing to their consumers, but that's probably a question for another energy-related episode. America is an incredibly dangerous country. It's comprised of dangerously armed people who happen to own pew-pew devices. Many have misunderstood this subset of society. Why do they need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons? Isn't there a better way to be safe, like trusting the police, whom we've been told over the last few years that we shouldn't trust? Wouldn't finding identity with other much safer groups be more conducive to a more secure society? Besides, this group can't be at that large and impactful, right? I mean, gun owners can't be that large and impactful. That's why we've brought in our guest today to discuss the differences between gun owners and non-owners, and how understanding that difference or gap can represent an important explanation for voter choice, voter turnout, perceptions of personal and public safety, preferences for gun control policies, and support for the death penalty.
Wow.
Yeah. It's kind of a weird one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like you're starting down another podcast trail there.
Yeah, I got distracted.
Had to reel yourself back in.
Yeah,
but you had to talk about Kobe Bryant in the middle of that?
I did.
Come on now. Why?
Because he's the best three-point shooter of all time.
R.I.P., man.
Why would you bring it there?
Well, didn't you?
I didn't.
I thought you did.
Well, you inferred wrong.
Swish.
So, Professor Joslyn, before we jump into your book today, I'd love to give our listeners some insight. As a professor at the University of Kansas, what got you interested in political science and teaching? Were you always interested in teaching political science?
No, I wasn't. And just before, I think Stephen Curry might.
There you go.
Oh,
There you
yeah.
go.
Okay.
Kobe Bryant was not quite a 3-point.
Maybe I should look. Maybe I should
no,
look.
no, I hadn't planned on teaching political science at all, and not teaching, period. My route to where I ended up was very circuitous, very almost random at certain points. I did an MBA first. Now that was the late 80s or mid 80s. I recall the most famous movie at the time was called Wall Street. I don't know if you remember that movie, and that was impactful, and I wanted to be that guy, and I wasn't. But I stayed in academics, and I started to enjoy the writing and the theorizing and the discussing of topics, and I got an MA in economics along the way, and that got me quite a bit more serious about academics in general, and I applied to a school in St. Louis, Washington University, and I got in and took off from there. And so political science, given my background, it does touch on most anything. So you can be a political science and specialize in business, or you can be political science and specialize in economics, or like I do, survey analysis and large mass attitudes. There's all sorts of institutional political science, so specialized just in Congress or just Supreme Court or things like that. So there's lots of variation within politics that attracted me because I had a lot of variation in academic experience, if you will, before coming in.
Well, it's interesting. You said you had an MBA in economics. And, excuse me, to me, the confluence of economics and some of the principles, some of the things we've gone through, you just take everything by, a quarter century at a time. The economic impact is most influenced by political agenda than perhaps anything else. And you can talk about the Fed and this and that, but that's a political device as well, political tool.
Sure.
And so I think the confluence of those two things is probably, at least in my estimate, one of the best places to come from if you're going to be a political science.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there's not a lot of talk in, say, master's school in economics about politics.
Why is that?
It's very abstract, theoretical, heavy statistical models, and they're apart from the reality of day to day. That's the academic side. Then, some move over into the more pragmatic side, and then a lot of it's politics, where the Fed becomes a political actor, not just a solely supply and demand type analysis.
Well, I think it's important in almost any analytical viewpoint to take a look at sheer numbers first when you're kind of cataloging or looking at big data or trying to come up with reasons for, reasons against any particular thing, like your book. Looking at different data points and data sets and coming up with graphs and charts and things to apply to what you talk about as the gun gap. But I think there's always a piece of that in a lot of academia that misses that overriding. I always go back and talk about the emotional side of things. Yeah. And that's really the social or the sociological side of what you're talking about. And I thought that I've read your book a couple of times, and I had to wake up a couple of times in between because it's an academic book. Right? I had to take my power nap, right? but just kidding. But no, it's really good because I haven't read many academic books that actually have some anecdotal stories in them like this. I think that's a real important piece that I'm sure we'll get to. Oh
yeah, we definitely will. I mean, that's definitely really interesting. I've always found it fascinating, talking to people who have, especially in your case, a very measured level of success and how they got to that point. I think that oftentimes people take a position on something and they say, "Oh, I'm going to go in this direction," and then life takes them somewhere else. So I think that's pretty interesting. You've authored over 50 journal articles, including publications in the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, Political Behavior, and Political Psychology. Per your book, much of your research explores political attitude formation and change, as you mentioned. With so much of your research exploring the granular nature of the political, I've noticed through your writing that you have an innate ability to keep things moderately based. Can you explain how you separate yourself from the polarizing nature of your research?
I was trained well. Where I was trained in Washington University, they took that particular aspect. There's a method by which you approach a topic. You don't care what's going on, in the news or the polarization you mentioned. That's not part of the analysis. The part of the analysis is just simply there's steps which you go. And wherever the conclusion is that's your conclusion. That has changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I was trained, that's exactly how it was. In fact, the big, back in the day when I was trained, the big complaint about academics is they were not connected to reality. The complaint I see for some of the younger folks in academics is they're too connected. They're too worried about how their results fit into a particular political agenda. And I think that has some implications for this book. This book is written for two audiences. One is an academic audience that's saying, where have you been? And the other is really an audience that follows academics, that is political practitioners and journalists who tend to follow a lot of academic writing, not theoretical writing, but the implications of it. And if you don't have, for example, if there's no writing at all about gun owners in academics, you won't see a lot of discussion about it in post-election analysis or about topics in politics in journalism, wherever the writing happens to be. And so that's what the book's aimed at.
Yeah. See, this particular subject matter, though, it's interesting too, because I think the point you made earlier about, and I know you specifically said some of the younger crowd is too connected to wherever they think their position has to go to. I think it's actually further than that in a lot of ways. I think oftentimes there is a specific end result that is, and this has always been a problem in science in general. You're looking for a specific result because you want to, get a grant to do further research or whatever the case may be. So you're tying in your analytics to point you in that direction, which is the spin game, correct? But I think that this particular subject, because it has so much emotional volatility around it, tends to lend itself to people that are looking to narrowcast it to a certain audience. That's one of the reasons I thought that this book did a great job of kind of keeping right down the center lane, in particular to show the sides of things without being reflective bias.
Well, how can you study something accurately without being objective?
Well, you can't, but that's been my complaint in a lot of subjects we've talked about over the course of how many episodes have we done now?
This is 59, almost 59. 60 episodes.
So we've had some serious topics, and we've had some nice lighthearted topics, but the one thing that we can always agree upon is that there's so much echo chambering and bias that goes on in these things that it's hard to find a middle road. And you and I know, are pretty middle of the road on most things that we talk about.
What are you talking about?
Except you're kind of a radical at times.
Yeah, no, I consistently say that I'm black-pilled, which is probably something I should stop saying, but it is what it is. I do think it is quite interesting, though, from the nature of your book to go to Bull's point is, very often when I read scholarly subjects, you can kind of read between the lines and see some of the bias, at least these days. Maybe not so much with, books that are written, maybe early 2000s, but still, it seems like that is a growing nature of trying to prove a presupposed bias about something, and I'm not sure why that is, because we can talk about entertainment, but entertainment's been around for a long time.
But if you have a particular direction, if you stretch out time periods, and you have if you have a subject, and you talk about that subject 75% of the time in one light, and 25% of the time as the other side is the correct way, then this side is going to get more and more, as time goes on, it's going to be the mainstream. It's going to pull everything to this. It's going to be the center.
Yeah.
And that we talk about that in politics all the time. Things, the radical, the vocal minorities on either end of the political spectrum get all the attention, thus pulling their ranks further and further toward them. And now, I know from discussions with other people and even yourself that you believe the mass in between is much more prevalent and much stronger than we all give it credit for, and it tends to bring us back to a more median approach to the future. But I don't know.
That's true within most academic fields too. You hear a lot from the small minority of those who are biased, who are out there on Twitter every day, or who have got their agendas. But that's for the most part, not the most part, in large measure, it is.
There was this training coming out again right there.
That there's not every academic's writing to because they have an axe to grind. Not every book is produced, but the books that sell are often ones that are narrowcasted, and that's
Right.
the incentive
Exactly.
Wolf has talked about. There is incentive there. I mean, I'll get a lot more grant money if I narrowcasted that book, and if I pitched it to a particular grant-making institution, in a particular, for example, in gun research. That will, talking the way in which this book is pitched, it will never ever receive any support money-wise. What will is if it's linked to violence.
Yeah.
Guns and violence produce, that's where 99.9% of the research money is. And so that's what you see produced, that academics produce where the money's. There's really no other alternative. And that's a huge bias because we don't understand guns, gun culture, gun owners, and guns and politics and gun sociology because we're so wrapped up in guns and violence.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's not important, but you can only run down that path for so long, right? I mean, how long are you going to? There's no resolution to that answer, that question. So they're going to throw millions and millions of dollars on that for the next 20 years, and we're going to end up in the exact same point because all the effort is toward, does more guns equal more violence? Yes or no? Where does that take us?
So, and my struggle with it, I feel like that's kind of a non-falsifiable premise, right? Because that there's so many other factors associated, at least in my opinion, I could be wrong, but so many other factors associated with the usage of guns, how people interpret guns, as you talk about in the book, the ownership levels of guns and how people perceive that ownership related to policies. So for me, I guess my question is the intention purely because that's where the money's going? They think that people are just more interested in reading more about violence, and that's the polarizing nature of things? Because objectively, as someone who appreciates, books like this that are moderate and have positions that it's not like I'm trying to digest someone's opinion or bias, right?
I mean, it's the old saying, right? If it bleeds, it leads, and that's it's an economic, verifiable thing that you can look at throughout history.
Yeah,
it's also very intuitive, right? I mean, it's on any movie you watch. A gun doesn't walk in, and there's some consequence.
Gun walks in, shoots itself.
Right?
That would be entertaining.
That was poorly phrased. Thank you. I'm glad you caught that. But it's intuitive grasp, and it has a huge constituency behind it. Would like to prove that there is a correlation between guns and violence, or that there's not. There's two sides. Now, think about this, though. We live in, everybody talks about we live in the United States and there's more guns per capita anywhere in the world and there's more violence. And they're aggregating across thousands of areas. Now, let's take one of the highest per capita gun areas in the country is Nevada. And in Henderson, Nevada, there's no gun crime there, right? So the gun per capita there is tremendously high, but there's no link to violence. Violence is sorted into very small geographical areas of cities and counties and states. And so the correlation between guns and violence is often indirect because those small areas are creating a lot of that correlation, where other areas are completely high guns, no violence, or low violence.
Would it be possible, and this is just an observational standpoint, would it be possible that correlation is almost a faulty correlation? Almost, not totally, but almost a faulty correlation? Because, I mean, if you look at Henderson, you'd expect, per the argument of mainstream media and those who are very
but you got to dive into the socioeconomic factors involved in that. You also got to dive in, per the read of this book, you also have to dive into the viewpoint, and also the generational viewpoint on guns.
Yeah.
Because a big portion of what you talk about in the first stage of the book is who owns a gun, and the demographics around that.
Right.
And people that own the gun have a gun culture in their family history or their associated family history, whether it's from hunting or whether it's from a sense of patriotism or whether it's from a sense of military kind of background. All those kinds of things apply. So you got to look at that. And the demographics in the United States have continued over the course of the last century to push toward urban dwelling, away from the rural, and toward family generationally that have less and less contact with these. I've always had the opinion of them as tools, which I know you've mentioned in the book once or twice. It's pushed away from using these tools as anything to identify with their personal safety or anything else. And that's an interesting, because it's a direction our country is still going. It's not changing.
Well, that's why I think that, because I think a lot of people hold that position. And as someone who is biased in this area, because I do own a firearm, my perspective has always been, it's a tool until someone picks it up. And at that point, it could still be a tool, or it could be a weapon. Well, it could be something that could harm someone. What it
becomes changes with its usage.
Yeah. So I guess my point about the faulty correlation being that it's almost like, and this is the frustration I've had with a lot of discussions in America, is it's almost like we've taken a position on things, be it guns or religion or certain rights in certain areas, that are almost watered down so much that making the argument in and of itself in the, like, say, for example, the advocation of gun control. The argument's so watered down that it's almost as if they don't take into consideration the alternatives, which is, yes, we can have measured gun control, but also have a culture that understands weaponry. We can't have both, in my opinion, when it comes to the argument from MSM. And I think it's a faulty correlation because...
No,
right?
That's what it is. I agree that they want to dichotomize it. You can't have both.
No.
Right? But we do have both. A sociologist who does study this and who's got a very nice view of this in terms of moderation, in terms of thoughtfulness, and trying to understand things as opposed to grinding an axe. He says guns are normal, and normal people own guns. And if you start with that premise, you look around and that's true. There's just too many gun owners to say it's not true, right? And that if you take that and take it out farther, it isn't quite as scary as the world as one side would suggest. Most guns, 90 millions aren't involved in anything nefarious at all. Most gun owners aren't involved in anything nefarious. You hear about the very tiny, tiny fraction that exists. And so that's going to scare anybody, but that doesn't mean these two cultures, as you mentioned, can't coexist.
Yeah.
They have a more difficult time coexisting when everybody is pointing fingers at each other and saying this is bad or this is good, etc. If more people would approach this in a more sensible way, as opposed to how politicians approach it and those who have incentives because of who's voting for them, et cetera, then we wouldn't have much problem. And that was true in American society in the 1970s.
Yeah.
You look at some of the data in the book, there's no polarization on this issue at all. And that's probably at the peak of how many guns that were owned by families. All people had guns or were very familiar with guns.
It was almost 50% back in like 72,
It's still
I think.
over a majority of
It's
people live in a
44
household
now,
with a
43.
gun.
Yeah.
That's true today. And so, and most non-gun owners know a friend who has a gun. It's very common. The question is it as dangerous and as powerful politically as it should be? And I think it's overrated in a sense in terms of that.
One of the premises of your book is that this gun gap, and you've used that term in several different ways in the book, but the primary one that I see is that it's not necessarily ignored, but it's a minimized, but probably fairly critical indicator of voting patterns, of not just on a national level, but even a state and a regional level. And I agree that it's missing, but it's still a very, very volatile political football either way. So the question is why is it that politicians that are looking to engage with their constituency in a way that gathers their base and more solidly in a direction will use guns and guns control legislation, et cetera, to manage those bases? Why do they use that as such a volatile political football and not use it as such an indicator of what's coming next as far as the voting populace is concerned?
I don't know.
That's why I was confused.
Oh, no, that's what led me into this book. Certainly the angst and tumult about guns is obvious to anybody who watches our politics. You can see it in the commercials. You can see it in there. So politicians understand they can divide up the pie in a particular way that creates a positive election outcome for them if they use guns as an issue. But it's not discussed as an important group or as a group at all, like gender is, like race, like wealth, like age. And we can go right down the list, education versus non-education. It's completely ignored. You and I, both you know the different coalitions from Democrat and Republican, and they're all full of different categories of people. Guns is absent.
It's identity politics missing one identity.
Yeah.
Right. But you know it's out there because, like you said, politicians use it on occasion. The parties differ on it when they decide to on an election, on occasion, not always. And but the people who communicate politics to us, journalists, don't use it at all. They talk about it legislatively. You've heard about it, but not about voters.
But is it
as a group, a membership group that's powerful, right? They talk about the NRA, right? But that's not what this book's about. This is about millions of gun owners who aren't even associated with the NRA, how they vote, predictably one way or the other.
Do you think that it might have something to do with the fact that if they recognize that coalition as a group, then that coalition will thus enact because your book points out that there's more civic duty to some degree associated with gun owners, how they view themselves. Do you think that if they were recognized as that group, that civic duty and involvement would increase? Do you think that's why they avoid that?
I think there's a counterintuitive nature to this particular subject. And it jumped out at me when I was reading a portion of your book that talked about how when, the Democratic Party would win the White House, Obama, for instance, and there was a lot of thinking that there was going to be negative legislation against the gun ownership crowd, which there was not, by the way. As a matter of fact, it kind of went the other way in some aspects. Mm-hmm. But because of that, the gun lobbies, hell, I'm surprised they don't want you to vote for Democrats. Because every time, if we're talking about economics again, right? The main, if Smith & Wesson makes a lot more money when a Democrat's in office than they do when a Republican's in office.
Yeah.
So some of this stuff is a little more
counterintuitive. Is that the game?
What? Hold it. Get my tinfoil hat out.
There's some pretty interesting evidence. I mean, the best salesman for guns was Obama. Mm-hmm. And the worst was Trump. A couple of them went bankrupt, the gun makers. So, and the NRA didn't do very well under Trump either.
They had to move to Texas, didn't they?
Well,
or are they moving to? I don't even
they
know.
did. They moved to Texas. New York Attorney General attacked them on all sorts of different issues. But when there's a Democrat in office, gun makers and gun interests generally do better. Because of the threat of more regulation.
You mentioned something a second ago, though, that I hadn't really thought about as much, and I don't know why, but the people that communicate with us on all levels, including a lot of the platforms that are out there now, I was going to say mass media, but I want to mainstream media. I was thinking of mass shootings. We'll probably get into that at some point, but mass media is primarily from huge population zones. New York, L.A., Chicago, Atlanta, those are the primary focal points of all dissemination of news in this country, for sure. And that is, if you look at your socioeconomic data that you put together in here, those are the areas that have generational absence of this gun or this tool in the house.
Absolutely, northeastern.
So there's going to be, I saw in some of your charts, there was a 20 or a 30 point general normal gap between the viewpoint of non-gun owners versus gun owners over in their safety and security in a certain area. So again, it comes down to the mass media.
Yeah, well, I think it was interesting, that quote you brought up. Guns are normal. Normal people own guns. I think one thing people need to pay attention to is own. Everyone who's perpetrating crimes with weapons, most of the time it's not their gun. I mean, at least I would think. I think they get it from the black market, or they'd take it from someone else. That's kind of the whole gun show loophole thing people bring up, which they need to change the name of that. It should be like, I don't know, like hand-me-down gun loophole or something like that. I mean, it's just from my perspective. But I do think you have a point. There is an intentional misrepresentation of a very large subset of society that, if it was interpreted appropriately, I would say probably would have a positive effect culturally, but a net negative effect politically, in my opinion. I could be wrong, though.
Well, let me give you an example. Guns were an extremely powerful issue in 2000. Mm-hmm. So Al Gore versus Bush, right? And you know that was an extremely close election decided by Florida, essentially. Florida would have been irrelevant if Gore would have won his home state, Tennessee. He lost his home state. And the Democrats, post-election analysis, elite Democrats who get together and think about why they lost, attribute that loss to his strong gun control positions, which were, reflective of the early 90s under Clinton, in which he was helpful in passing federal legislation. One of those pieces was a ban on AR-15s, right? And so Democrats thought he was just too tough on gun owners. We have to do something, right? And so the next time around, they changed their approach. We're not going to attack gun owners and make them feel bad, like what you hear today. What we're going to do is say, all we want is sensible, reasonable regulations, and John Kerry is going to be our president, and he's a hunter.
Yeah. And
they showed him hunting goose out in western Pennsylvania. Now, he never looked particularly good doing so. Just like him surfing.
I'm going to shoot this gun now.
So he lost that election, of course, and very tight election as well. But after that, Democrats said no more.
Why?
Because they lost.
Literally, that's it?
They felt that the kind of, within any organization, changes happen, different people come to power, and the new kind of consulting group that came to power said, nah, we're not going that way.
See, that gap, and that year you're talking about with Kerry, that gap was still 18 points between non-gun owners and gun owners as far as their voting.
Well, I think. Well, go ahead.
No, I'm just it widened from 2000
it
on. The gap between the propensity of gun owners to vote Republican versus non-owners. This is what we're talking about as a gap. That has widened considerably since the 70s, and it took off in 2000.
Yeah, well, and I guess my obviously your answer it makes a ton of sense. I just think that it's one of those answers that's so simple. It's kind of like, really? Because you'd think that if there was such a close margin of election, they would think, well, if we have close elections going forward, then it can go either way, and we could technically win more than we would lose. Right?
I don't disagree. That's part of the book. Like I said, I wrote it to journalists and those who advise campaigns.
Yeah.
I don't understand, why they pulled back so quickly on this issue. They could have been very moderate on the issue and won many more. Remember, Republicans own guns, the greatest percentage of that group of Republicans own guns, but there's more Democrats and independents who own guns than Republicans.
Right.
So there's lots of gun owners that aren't Republican that are very viable for Democrats to attract.
Yeah.
But you're not going to attract people when you're attacking them.
Yeah.
Right.
If you were just listening to the major media outlets out there, you would think the only ones that actually own any guns are old white Republicans that just got out of church that day.
Right.
That's the perception that people are given them.
Or the yeehawk.
And also the only people against them are the ultra liberal downtown New York, Antifa kind, the people, that would rather throw Molotov cocktails and use a gun.
Oh, but Antifa's very pro-support of guns. They're they are pro-gun. You want to talk about pro-gun group? That's a pro-gun group right there. I guess my whole point being, it just seems counterintuitive, as you were saying, because John Kerry, look, I think the reason he lost probably.
Bad hairdo.
I mean, obviously, it's got to go back to the fact that all elections are fraudulent.
Here you go. Here we go.
Joking.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess my point being is you'd think that the parties would understand if they took a moderate position on some things that they would have a chance to win more. Because as someone who is a gun owner, as I mentioned earlier, so everyone notices, don't ever come to the freaking the den. We're dangerous here. I see that and I say, okay, well, I know there's Democrat candidates that I support some of their policies. Tulsi Gabbard's a great example. She's fantastic. I like her a lot. She's very moderate. I'm not a huge fan of her gun policy, but she's not out here saying that I'm a dang yee hick guy down in South Alabama who's ready to pull up whatever the flag was, the rebel flag that people hate so much, so a Confederate flag. So that's what I appreciate. And you'd think that most candidates would be like, that's probably a good position to have, because as we've discussed, the people who have the most power are the people who are loved as opposed to the people who are feared, in my opinion.
But it all comes down to economics, which Mark was talking about earlier. If his background's in economics, people don't get elected unless they have a lot of money in their coffers. And if their party base, if the DNC or the Republican Party are pulled to the right or pulled to the left, then if you want that base and you want that money and you want to be the guy on the stage talking to the opponent at the end of the day, then you've got to move. What do they say about primaries, right? Primaries always fly to the direction that is furthest away from the center. And then as the main election occurs, then they come back toward the center. Yep. So you can see it in election after election, except for guys like Trump that just say, I don't give a shit about anything. I'm going to say whatever I want, and if you don't like it, I don't.
Everyone's my enemy.
That's right. But go back to Bull's, not Bull. Sorry, Wolf. I'm looking right at you.
We're the same.
Your basic point is, why are the parties doing this?
Yeah.
And one thing to remember about any way of looking at politics, you don't have to impose rationality onto them. And then they're just not. They're entities full of a lot of different people who are, some are extremely bright, some aren't. It just depends. And they don't always make the right choices in terms of these issues. And depending on the issue, as you mentioned, Bull, a lot of these issues are fraught with emotion and principle. And so they're making decisions with emotion, principle, and strategic electoral positions in mind. All three of those together suggest you're going to make the wrong decision sooner or later. And they often do. The NRA in the 70s was not aligned with either party. And at that moment, they were up for grabs. And they were growing as an institution, getting stronger as an institution. And Republican Party welcomed them. It was a smart move electorally because the NRA recognized the power of so many people that were members. And they instead of doing the old institutional analysis, we'll lobby tightly and go to your office and try to convince you for legislation, they used their members in terms of electoral pressure. And that, at that point, everybody started recognizing at least practitioners, start recognizing the power of a gun lobby, and further, i.e., members. And so, what the book details is gun owners have a huge inherent advantage in mobilization versus non-owners. Because if you buy a gun, the odds are sooner or later, first you'll probably take a class or train with it. Second, that will involve target shooting, and you might go to the range. Let's say over 50% of gun owners go to a range regularly. They buy ammunition, they target practice, they meet other gun owners. That kind of group is a perfect place for parties to mobilize people. They interact with each other. They talk about guns. They talk about the issues in politics they're located in centrally located places like that. Then you have the NRA structure imposed on top of that, which has offices in every state, I believe in counties as well, and all the way at the federal level. So they have a huge organizational structure in which the Republican Party can pull from and use mobilization techniques to get people to come out and vote. And then underneath that, you got gun ranges, informal social groups, hunting groups. All of that is perfectly suited to organization, get out the vote. Where non-gun owners have nothing in common except one thing that mobilizes them: mass shootings.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thing that has started slowly to counteract this structure that the gun owners have. But as I showed in the book, gun owners are far more likely to show up at polls and vote, whether it be for a mayoral election, a student board election, or presidential election. Mm-hmm. Now that's just from one aspect of mobilization. The other aspect is most elections, many of them, threaten gun owners' interest, right?
Yeah.
The Democrats are, we need to regulate more. We can even do reasonable regulations, but a lot of gun owners don't trust that, right? Because the Republicans say, no, that's slippery slope. They're going to really regulate you, don't. So I have something at stake. In almost every election, a gun owner feels like something they have might be taken away from them. Then secondarily, there's this huge structure out there in which it's easy to mobilize them. Mm-hmm. Another important part of the book that is often unrecognized, I show in there a statistic, gun owners stay in one place more than non-owners. What that means is they're easy to find. So young people don't vote because they're always moving around the country and so they're hard to mobilize, hard to find. Once you move into a place, you don't register. You have all sorts of different things you have to do. Gun owners tend to stay in one place. They own a home, more likely to own a home than non-owners, and they're more likely to pay their mortgage off than non-owners. Mm. All that means I know where they're at. They're reliable voters. They're reliable citizens. And
I think you had a statistic in there as well on top of all that spoke to how they view voting in general. Is it a duty or is it just a privilege?
Right.
And the gun owners felt it was a duty as opposed to the non-owners, which speaks to more than just the ability to organize them. It speaks to kind of a disposition or a viewpoint. It's not just the government is always something to be watched, which, I mean, that's frankly one of the main pillars on which the United States was formed in the first place. You better watch who the government is back in England, because if you don't, they're going to tax you into oblivion. Right. Oh, really? Didn't we just pass something with another 87?
Hey, be careful there, Bull. Be careful. You're calling the kettle black there.
No, I'm not a kettle. I'm not calling anybody anything. Yeah. I'm just the point is that the idea of having a watchful eye on those that are quote unquote in charge is from a person that's almost entirely logical based as my first premise, makes a heck of a lot more sense than blindly trusting everybody that we vote into office, because Jesus, that's insanity.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing I think is interesting about gun owners specifically, is because it does seem that there is an inherent distrust, which I've never really understood trust of government, in my opinion, ever, and that's maybe because I took political science classes.
Isn't it more trust and verified than distrust, though? I mean, I forget who said that first. I know it was in a Reagan speech years and years ago, but that's kind of what it is. Hey, I'm going to trust you.
Well, I think I think it depends on. I think it depends on the group we're talking about, right? Because I would see that there's not very much government criticism from my demographic. I wouldn't say that. I'd say there's a lot of fall in line, listen to the popular subject, discuss with the group, and be accepted by the group by agreeing with anything that comes out of the popular group's mouth. I think that a lot of groups, specifically millennials and Gen Zers, actually fall subject to that, which may change. Hopefully it does. But at the same time, I do see, through the book that, from the data from the book, that there seems to be almost a staunch solidarity among gun owners, as you were saying, when it comes to them interacting with each other in opposition to the public and social trends of bigger government and bigger control.
Is it because it's a voluntary solidarity, though?
I would say so.
I mean, I look at what you brought up as far as structure is very interesting to me, because when I think of gun ownership, I think of more this individualism, but there's structure on top of that is not often recognized. And you point that out very well, but there's also very large structures, just generally unions we could talk about, that are very important to the fabric of our society. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that forever, but they're required to those that belong to unions. They're not voluntary, or not in most states, and pretty soon probably never in any state. They're if you're going to be in this career path, then you're going to be part of the union. So the NRA may use its strength to organize, but it's kind of herding cats over here. The other group is the unions, if you will, that I'm talking about, maybe AFL-CIO or something like that, is a required membership if you want to be employed by this group. So the money that you contribute over here that funnels to whichever party they're going to funnel it to, it isn't a voluntary contribution.
Yeah, but I do think gun ownership and gun involvement in groups is probably voluntary. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I don't think there's any data outside of that to suggest that it isn't. Maybe it'll change. But I do think that you brought this up earlier, but I do think it'd be something to talk about, and we kind of touched on it. You in your chapter 1 of the book, you mentioned gun ownership was a bipartisan issue that's no longer the case. Obviously, that much is true with the declining rates of ownership among independents, which is 32% in 2016, and Democrats which is 24% in 2016. Yet Republicans have remained steady. I would love to talk more about if Republican gun ownership over time will be subject to decline over the next few years, or do you think it's going to be steady or go up?
I don't have any reason for it to believe that it would go down. It's as you noticed in some of the data, it's stayed steady since the 70s. So it's got, Republicans are being reinforced in terms of gun ownership, meaning their party agrees with it. Democrats, if you're a Democrat gun owner, there is some dissidence, right? That you hear your party talking sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, talking against your interest, possibly. Now, having said that, Biden owns a gun, and so does the vice president.
We know Hillary's packing too, so.
Yeah, but people own guns for a variety of different reasons. But what I'm saying is Republicans, their possession of a gun is well aligned with their political views, and so it's much easier to keep that at that level. I think some of the decline in gun ownership is the loss of rural life, and the decline in hunting as well. And so a lot of people just own rifles. They'd say own a gun. Well, they never used them in the same way we might think with a handgun. So that's going to inevitably change. And Democrats tend to be the ones who aren't rural. So you're seeing that decline too. I don't see Republicans going down in terms of that.
Now, to that point, I obviously, while reading your book, I read a few articles. An article from May of this year, 2022, for future listeners. U.S. gun sales have almost doubled since the start of 2020, rising from an average of 1 million guns sold a month in 2019 to nearly 2 million a month in 2020. That was source data from the FBI and Small Arms Analytics, a firearms research consulting company based in South Carolina. Do you think, to the point we just discussed, that the numbers reflective of those changes are based more around polarized political worries, or do you think maybe the changes in ownership are due to rises in crime or changes in policy of certain areas like Seattle, Chicago, New York? And do you think that increase in purchases of guns is going to be impactful in future elections?
That's a good question. I think they're both. In other words, the great gun buying spree of 2020 and into 2021 was in part a result of both political tensions and the pandemic. And if you could separate politics from pandemic for a moment, the pandemic itself produced an uncertainty independent of politics amongst many thousands of millions of people that once you get to a level of uncertainty and loss of control, the lines in gun stores get longer.
Yeah.
Not just for previous gun owners too. That a lot of previous gun owners are buying these guns, so they're adding to their arsenal, if you will. But lots of first-time gun owners, women and blacks, were the chief new gun owner purchases during 2020, 2021. Security, right? But that has also to do with the tumult during the summer of 2020, right? The things you mentioned. That creates also a lot of uncertainty for citizens in those areas. Not everybody was demonstrating, and the fires and looting, et cetera, that creates a need I have to safeguard my situation. And so that led to more gun ownership, gun ownership. That's two reasons. So the pandemic, compile that with the summer of 2020, and then add into that an election coming up where many gun owners expected Biden to win, which is we better buy guns now because he's going to change the situation. And both sides, because I have friends on both sides of this issue, they both told me that they're going to go buy guns because they're not sure not only who's going to win, but what will happen afterwards.
That's
and believe
hilarious.
Me, that was a serious discussion I had with many people, with highly educated people. By the way, writing a book on guns, you get a lot of revelations from people you never had before.
Yeah.
By the way, come here for a second.
Let me tell you what I think.
No, well, not just those, but hey, I have a gun. Did you know that? No, I didn't know that. Don't tell anybody, but I have one. Two neighbors I had when I was writing the gun book. They were my neighbors for several years, and they both invited me in the house. They had huge gun arsenals, and I had no idea. But once I started the book,
that's so funny that you say that, because one of the things that I was thinking about while I was reading through this again was the nature of fear and uncertainty and risk tolerance, if you will, and how that applies so much to whether you want and have a gun, whether you think it's for security, whether you not, we don't know what's in our neighbors' houses. We're sitting in one now. We have no idea what's next door on either side of us or across the street.
Oh, I do. I know.
Okay. Except the wolf.
Wolf,
been
I know
creeping along
everything,
at
yeah.
night and, howling at the moon.
I can smell
Exactly. You can
the
smell a gun
residue.
a mile away. The powder.
The ballistics.
That's right. But my point is number one, your decision making is all based on constantly calculating and recalculating risk analysis. That's what people make decisions. That's one of the primary factors that make decisions. And when uncertainty comes into the picture, and more outside circumstances that are out of our control come into, we need to protect ourselves. So now some people look to guns as a method of solidifying their false or real sense of security.
Sure.
Other people look to communities, other people look to church, other people look to all over the place. But it's not surprising that these statistics go in the direction they do. But my point of it is I don't feel about my neighbors in my neighborhood. I don't know what's going on inside their houses, the ones I don't know. Not at all. I don't know whether they have a frickin' bazooka in there or a BB gun or nothing.
Or an F-15.
Well, exactly. An F-15.
they're more
I'll know
likely
that.
to have that.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you told them you were writing a book on guns, they might. In other words, the judgment that they were worried about was gone.
But the question is
wanted to
if I knew, if I saw all those houses and said, that one has 3 guns, that one has 0, that one has 15, that one has a cannon. From my point of view, I forget my point of view for a second. How does it change your thinking about the people around you? Because what my whole point is, the perspective of one side versus another. Yeah,
I'll tell you that some fascinating data I ran into, and it's published in the book, is if you own a gun, you would. This is in general, because I know a lot of gun owners who say, "No way, I wouldn't do this, but in general, most gun owners feel safer in neighborhoods who allow guns, who have guns.
Henderson, Nevada.
And so they want more guns around them. And the more guns you own, the more likely you want guns around you. You feel safe with more guns. Non-gun owners, it's just the opposite. I mean, complete opposite. They do not want, they don't feel safe with guns in the house. They don't feel safe with guns in the neighborhood at all.
But the extending question, though, Mark, is what do they feel safe with?
Yeah, because you did mention
which group?
The non-gun owners.
Because you did mention in your book
with no guns.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
but okay.
Could I touch on this? Because he did mention this. You said that particular group, guns are not conceived as a means of empowerment. Rather, they're seen as destabilizing, is what we're talking about. So I guess to your point, that is a viable question. If you live in a world where no guns, it's implausible, at least from my perspective, to assume that there would be no guns. I mean, someone's going to get a gun. If it's illegal, if all of them are banned, it's not like that just removes the danger of someone having a firearm.
Well,
so
the counter to that is there's less likelihood, right? If you pull all the guns out
of a
confiscate
non-criminal
all of it,
having a firearm.
well, criminals will still have a
likelihood would go
rougher
up.
time getting them too, supposedly. Of course, they don't have trouble
don't think
getting
so.
anything else in this country. That
Yeah,
they
I
want,
don't think
but,
so. I think it'd be easier.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm playing devil's advocate.
Well, the reason
but I'm
I-
just saying, if all guns disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, I would be going, okay, great. Then we could have this discussion about knives.
Well, I guess
Right.
that yeah, and that's my point is it's just such an interesting observation just from my perspective, because I mean the reason we my wife and I, the reason we chose to become owners is because of that particular facet of risk, right? So during the 2020 rioting and stuff like that, there was some stuff going down in our neighborhoods. We're like, we probably should get something, just in case. We'll never likely use it unless we go and train with it. But other than that, I mean, I have no intent to use it in my home. That's a bad thing if I use it in my home. That's like a DEFCON 5. Like, that's not the one we want to be at. We don't want to be anywhere near that particular scenario. With that being said, it just seems implausible logically for people to wish away those things and think that's a possibility. You get what I'm saying?
Well, it's wishing away reality. Guns have been around since what?
Yeah, but
they say
246 years
70
in America.
Oh, in America,
246
but
years.
the
in
first
America.
guns were Chinese, like
Yeah.
almost
But
everything.
wolf and bull, which implies animals of predatory nature.
I don't
No,
know.
bulls
I saw
are-
that,
he's an
You
omnivore.
should have
At
heard
least
that
for
bull
wolf.
sound.
At least for wolf.
That bull sound was like a wounded animal
Not
in the woods.
everybody would agree with your particular discussion. They're going to say the last thing they want is a gun to protect them. In fact, they see guns as highly risky and unprotected, no matter who owns it. And so they might say, yeah, the less guns, the better. Well, they not might. They do say not only less guns, the better. No guns, the better.
Yeah, but then
And then the gun rights people feel. I'm not undermining what they feel. They're saying, I feel better with the gun. I feel safer, which is what you just said. So you have two groups who completely can't talk to each other because one wants to regulate something this one believes is sacrosanct and I need it in my house to protect my family. And the other is saying, if you have it in the house, it scares the hell out of me, right? So how do you get those two groups to come together? You don't have politicians who pander to them.
Yeah.
Because when they pander to them, they only create more fear
More of a divide.
from each other.
Yeah.
It's a top-down, elite-driven problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's not citizens' problem. It's the elite's problem. And they win by this. They win by creating this tension because they can win an election this way.
They create this tension in all kinds of identity politics
all
matters,
sorts of
except
different
this
issues.
one.
Well,
This is why
What do you mean
they
except for
use
this
it as like I was saying earlier. They use it as a political football, but they don't identify it as a primary disparity in how they get into and get thrown out of office.
well, I don't
why
know if they can.
I'm so
though.
surprised that this hasn't been something that people have grabbed
No,
onto.
they do identify. I would say, just make this distinction. They identify it as a primary issue,
Yeah.
but they don't. The larger discussion about guns stays as an issue, not as a identity amongst
because it's
millions of people.
dehumanizing. Yeah.
See the difference? So an identity that you're a gun owner now.
Yeah.
That implies several identity.
Well, it also
cues.
humanizes guns. It does.
No, I'm saying it's an identity like a white male's an identity.
Yeah.
but doesn't it
lesbian
make a
females
doesn't make it a
identity.
better
There's
identity?
all sorts of these different things that are possible, right?
Well, I guess
They don't want to recognize, they being people who discuss politics generally, they don't say gun owners.
Yeah.
They say the NRA.
Well, that's
Or
why
they say something more narrow. It's like saying this. It's like saying NAACP versus African Americans.
Yeah.
Right? How do we discuss politics? We talk about blacks or African Americans. When we talk about mass politics, we talk about whites, males, etc. We don't talk about gun owners. We talk about the NRA.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference because it's not recognizing people who are gun owners who have them that have verifiable, consistent, predictable patterns of behavior over time, and they're a huge benefit to one party, not the other. And we ignore it.
My question
And
is still the same. Why is that?
Well,
so you're identifying.
Well, I think
a
I know,
body.
though.
Well, hold on. Like, you're identifying a body. You're identifying the NRA as this target, right?
Yeah.
Presumably because you don't want to target individuals. You don't want to demean individuals, the individual gun owner, because they might be. There's a lot of independents that are, matter of fact, more independents than I think.
I think you put your finger on it.
But-
It's
but
better
they
to
don't do that
demonize
with
the
any
NRA,
other
not the
identity.
gun owners.
Well,
You don't do it with
the
any
reason they
other
don't do it with any other identity because it's advantageous to a lot of groups, specifically in power right now, to dehumanize one specific group. If I say, for example, that you the bull, you own so and so, and you have this thing, but you're a gun owner. To Mark's point, it's much more humanizing from a political perspective and an arguments perspective when you recognize that facet. If they're specifically talking about the NRA, all you're doing is you're creating a spooky monster in a closet you can't see. No one knows what the NRA is. They talk about National Rifle Association. Okay, what does that mean to you? What honestly, what imagery wise, if I said to somebody who doesn't own a gun, what's going to pop into your head? I don't know. I mean, for me, I'm not even a member, and I'm like, NRA, it's a group of people who support gun rights, and I guess they have a lot of money. I mean, that's not threatening, at least if you don't phrase it in a threatening way. It's always a big bad guy in the darkness when it comes to the mainstream media.
I understand what you're saying there. I do. But my whole point is right now, every other identity in identity politics is looking at the freaking color of your skin or the how many years of school you went to or not, or all these other things. So they're focused right. They're pointing a finger directly at whoever that identity is, except this one.
The reason they're not doing this one is because if they actually give it credence to a logical point, then people actually say, well, guns aren't really that big of a problem. Maybe I could get a gun. And to Mark's point, if you get a gun or have multiple guns, you're more likely to vote for a particular group. Maybe.
I don't think we're giving too much credit to some of these people. I don't think they... Anyway.
Here's a point maybe related, that the purchases during 2020 reflected a real search change in terms of what our stereotype of a gun owner is.
Yeah.
Now it's female, now it's urban, and it's also race is involved. And so what could happen over time, and it's to a certain extent it's happening, is that the Democrats are going to have to embrace this sooner or later because a significant group within their coalition is buying guns. And guns are becoming more prevalent, not less, within the Democratic coalition. Now, it doesn't mean because you buy a gun, you convert to Republican. No.
Nonsense.
That's a ridiculous aspect. But what happens, and you might, if you're a fairly new gun owner, it's just like buying a car.
Yeah.
You start to see that car around on the street. Oh, there's another car like that. And you have identification with that. Or you get mailers, you get communications, you're interested in your gun for other reasons than shooting. It's kind of nice. Or you meet other people. And over time, generally speaking, that creates its own communication system that tends to reinforce a particular partisan view. Yeah. It's generally, not always, but generally not Democrat.
I think what you create, though, is you create the same thing. Using your car analogy is a great one, because what you create is a bifurcation of type. So now you've got those gun owners that are, they're old school. They're those ones that are ready to, enter the Capitol on the wrong date of the year. And there's going to have that group. then you're going to have us responsible gun owners that are only buying the Prius of the guns.
Right. No, you have that.
But that's what's it's going to increase even more.
No, I've presented this book to several people, and one was a class that I teach regularly. It's military officers, and they're most gun control people you ever see. They all of them own guns. But the last thing they want is crazy crazy average folks who aren't trained with guns with them. And so they're imposing their particular training, their advanced training. They're assuming nobody else could handle it as well.
That's the same thing that happens.
That's what you're saying, the stratification within in a system like that, in a gun owner. But that just shows you how diverse gun owners would be.
Yeah.
Right? For example, I had published something in the newspaper, and somebody wrote in a newspaper. It was similar to this book, and it basically said gun owners tend to vote Republican. Now, that's a tendency. That doesn't mean every gun owner does. Mm-hmm. And I got completely overwhelmed by mailers who were Democrat gun owners saying they'd never vote Republican, right? And so I recognize there's a huge diversity within gun ownership. When 40% of the population, or at least, depending on the survey, at least a third owns a gun, sure, there's going to be vast diversity. It's millions and millions of people, right? That's the point. We don't understand this. Yeah. Nobody examines it. Nobody talks about the diversity within gun ownership because they don't talk about gun ownership to begin with, right? And so you wouldn't even know about these things.
Well, I feel like and as to your point, if the Democrat Party does move to a softer take or an acceptance on gun ownership, I do feel like it'll potentially eliminate the somewhat advantageous aspect of like tribalistic and polarizing arguments and natures that result in like a litany of non sequitur anti-gun arguments or false dilemma dichotomy arguments, or appeal to emotions. And I think a lot of that power, as I was saying a little bit ago, really ties into why they don't recognize it in the first place. You can't really make an appeal to emotion argument if the person that you're appealing to understands that the other side of the coin is also just like them. Right? I mean, because if you sit down with somebody and well, I don't vote Republican because I don't believe in the mass murder of children. How is that even correlated? But it is. That argument is very common. And so I guess from my perspective, my observational point is I do think that, to your point, they will have to make that adjustment, but I don't think it's going to go good for them. Because even though they'll make the Prius differentiation of, oh, well, this guy's got a Ruger as opposed to a Glock, or an AR-15, which is a spooky rifle that looks militarized but only shoots one bullet. I mean, it's one bullet per shot. It's not a fully automatic weapon. These whole arguments that perpetuate this almost, I don't want to be mean, but it's not informed position on these type of things.
But isn't that the same argument you can make for a lot of things?
Of course.
There's a large gap between informed and non-informed, and in today's society, with all the forms of communication we have, all the different. I would say, and I don't know if this is true, but one of the top ways most people get their news is from a headline on a social media app.
Yeah,
it's one of the very top ways these days. You can't dive into anything and have a good understanding of it unless you do more than that. And I'm not suggesting that everybody's got to do more than that to take a position. You can take a position any way you want, but just understand that there's always going to be a general populace that is not fully informed on a particular subject. Politicians know that. Academics know it. The military thing you talked about knows it. But therein lies the stratification that I worry about the most, because there's always, you said Biden and Harris own a gun. They own guns. They probably think that a certain socioeconomic group probably should never own a gun.
Of course they do.
Well, that's just elitism. That's all that is. I mean, name it whatever you want, but that's what it comes down to. And that's the same in a lot of these different subjects that we talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of relate this discussion generally, gun rights, gun control, similar to the war on drugs. I find it very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, you could take marijuana, for example. I mean, there was a huge point in time where people were very taboo against marijuana. Like, we can't have that legalized, even though, the NIH has ample data to suggest that heavy marijuana use can lead to abuse of alcoholism and further drug involvement, strangely enough. Over time, that changed because people had more exposure to it. They had more understanding of it. I think the same is in relation to guns. I mean, I don't know if we mentioned the numbers. I do have some statistics, but it's really in depth. I'll just generalize. 2020, there was about 45,000 deaths from guns, right? So gun, violence when it comes to accidents, all that jazz, suicides, about 45,000 deaths. And within that same year, there was double deaths when it comes to drugs.
No, just fentanyl.
Just fentanyl.
Just fentanyl.
So when it comes to, this whole understanding, I do find it to be a little strange that, and I think my position on them demonizing gun owners and the NRA just generally kind of holds true here, because there was a time where people demonized drug usage and marijuana, the gateway drug. I mean, I remember DARE when I was a kid. I don't remember what it stands for. I mean, drugs are really
exceptional.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. Exciting. Expressive. But I think that same thing holds true for gun owners. If they ever open the door to maybe understanding your neighbor who owns 1 or 2 guns, then their whole catalyst argument of, well, if we have more guns and there's going to be more violence and you are at risk, is going to go out the window. But that's just...
Guns aren't going anywhere. That's the whole thing. That if they're not going anywhere, and I think we can all agree upon that, then you have to say, what's the next step? We can't continue this polarization because it's not going to work as a society, as politics. So if you start with the premise they're not going anywhere, they're going to be regulated, but not to the extent that gun control people want, the extreme gun control people. So you got to take that next step, and you have to have politicians take this step, because it's politicians that divided us to begin with. And so you're looking for a candidate that's more centralized on this issue and can get people on board. It's just being reasonable.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe that's impossible.
Does reasonable get anybody elected anymore? I don't know.
It depends. It depends on
well, I guess if you say you're reasonable, if you say you're reasonable, that got our last president elected.
Yeah, but
right? He was supposed to be reasonable.
Yeah.
No, I'm just
He's
being
the
honest.
most reasonable. He's the most reasonable. Most reason.
Look, Uncle Joe.
Reason in Zable. That's what he said.
Sat in the basement.
If you think about what Democrats did
they
during the primary,
were smart as hell doing that.
Well, they were practical because he's the most moderate candidate that stood on that stage. So he's a gun owner too. Now, his rhetoric is appeasing the strong gun control.
Well, and he wouldn't know which side of the gun is the barrel or the handle, right? So, I mean, it's also that too.
I hope you're wrong about that. But what I'm saying, there's room for it. He comes from the kind of Clintonian wing. They were always kind of moderate.
Clinton got more done with the other side than I don't know of any president in the last 40 years, probably.
There's space there, and there'll be changes that might widen that space and take us back to where what we were talking about before, and guns disappears as an issue. But it'll be a while.
Well, I think what'll be interesting, and obviously I think this is going to be indicative of the next major election. I do think it's going to be interesting, to your point, whether moderate wins, because I think when it comes to the mainstream media and organizations that perpetuate this hysteria, hyperbolic type of position on things, they're not trusted by a lot of people these days. And I don't think that's going to go up at all. And that's the main focal point that people had prior to 2020 of determining who they were going to vote for.
But when you don't trust the communication coming your way, what's your fallback position?
You go straight to the source.
Well, okay, that's you and me, right? That goes.
I think
to
it's a lot more people.
The ones that are trying to be informed. That is not. I'm not being critical of anybody, but that is not. Think about the forms that come to you in the mail before a general or a primary election, and it has all the different props and this and that, and I mean you have to read every one of them like 12 times to determine if yes or no means what you think yes or no is supposed to mean.
Yeah.
So you know what ends up happening? People fall back into the position of their category, and their category is determined by 4 or 5 things that we call identities, right? And that's why I think this is such an important piece that is oftentimes missed, because if you can't understand or believe the Republican fully or the Democrat fully, and you're a Republican, you're going to vote Republican.
Yeah.
And if you're Democrat, you're going to vote Democrat. So all the focus has to be right in the middle. And where those people, do they like the person's rhetoric on one side versus another? Is there one or two elements that is more important to them than somebody else? That's what it goes to every time, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that's valid. I would like to think, and maybe this is just me being just naive old Wolfie. I would like to think that people have gotten so apathetic towards the nonsense that they're just going to disregard it going forward and say, okay, well, I'm just going to read what the candidate says. I'm going to see what he says verbatim, and if that makes sense to me, that's how I'm going to vote. Maybe not.
Or they're going to say, why should I vote for anybody? Right?
Yeah, but we thought that would happen last time, and it didn't.
Yeah, but if you get enough emotional rhetoric ginned up in the populace that hate one person enough or love one enough or want to be on the right side of history versus the wrong side of history, you can...
Yeah, but I think that also goes back to what we've discussed before about the referendum on Trump as opposed to the referendum on Hillary and vice versa and all that jazz. This last election was a referendum on Trump. It wasn't
2016.
So it was a referendum on Hillary.
It was a referendum. Bottom line, it was...
So
which of these two people I don't like do I want to vote for?
Yeah, but I guess my point being is I think the referendum might broaden. It'll stop being one individual and start being the whole catalog. And my whole point is, if that's the case, which I hope it is, because that means that we'll go back to grassroots politics. That means we'll go back to people learning about what's in their local community, reading about their local politicians, which trickle upwards, in my opinion. If that's the case, then people will start going to the source. They'll stop paying attention to these hyperbolic statements of, oh, well, Bill Masterson decides to support gun rights, so he believes in the total destruction of the children demographic. I mean, we'll go away from that. And I think that we are. Reason I say that is because it seems evident in the lack of trust in areas where you get that information. Your point makes sense in the sense that if everyone just becomes a turtle, if that's a turtle, if we all become turtles, then we're all screwed anyway, it doesn't matter. But if the inverse happens, or the alternative happens, and the fact that we all come out of our shell as turtles and start walking around as upright humans and fully complete the evolutionary cycle of turtle to human hybrids, and proving everyone's a lizard.
You watched way too many Mutant Ninja Turtles as a kid.
Yeah, dude,
that's what you did.
That was my Bible as a child.
Leonardo or whatever the hell those characters.
Jesus, Leonardo. But my whole point being is, if that's the case, then I think things will get a little bit more moderate.
I think you're wrong.
Well, that's great. I hope I'm not.
And I'm sorry, but the fallback position, I think, is general apathy.
I've got a quote here from his book that we should talk about.
We could do that, but I'm just saying that what decides the thing that makes people decide what to do or not to do is what's most important to themselves.
Self-preservation.
Number one. Correct. Mm-hmm. Correct. So the first thing they worry about is their own sphere. Mm-hmm. And when things are uncertain, as Mark was saying earlier, you have to circle the wagons. You have to be in Henderson, Nevada, surrounded by a whole lot of other guns, or downtown New York, surrounded by no other guns. Well, those are the two positions.
Yeah, but you also, in those two positions, you
vote for the party line.
Sure, but also, and you're not wrong. I think that's correct. With that being said, though, I would say that the people that are moving away from voting party line, because I think there will be a lot of them, because why would you vote party line if you're frustrated with the party that you're voting for? It's not like the Democrats have anybody in the wings. They got Gavin Newsom.
Dude, I've voted in a lot of elections. There's never been one that I've been happy with.
Okay, but that's a subjective. I'm not saying you should be happy. I'm saying
reality.
Whoa! We're all in the Bull's world right now, and I'm just
it's my world.
I'm the wolf in the Bull's world. But I get my point being is I would like to think that party line, bipartisanship, that type of stuff actually comes back, as opposed to people being able to recognize that candidates are not in and of themselves good and or bad. They're just all bad.
Well, and to Mark's point earlier, none of it really changes significantly. There's an underlying check and balance, oftentimes unbalanced, but there's an underlying check and balance that it always is there.
Yeah.
To correct and hopefully override.
Well, to wrap up, I would like to talk about two things. First off, I thought within your book there was an incredible, in my opinion, an incredible story about one of your students. We don't have to utilize the name if that's not the name, but my point being is I think it would be great to discuss his story and the analogy that he gave in relation to his in-laws, and how they came to accept
at that point his conceal and carry license and his gun ownership. I think that that's a fascinating story to paint for our listeners. So if people are on the edge or fence of whether they should support or be open-minded to it, I think that gives a really good, place to start.
The story about Jim, the student, illustrates the point that the underlying factor that drives people's attitudes toward guns are really their attitudes toward gun owners. And if you have favorable feelings toward gun owners, concealed carry is fine with you. Doesn't, independent of whether you're a Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. That affect orientation, that how you feel towards someone drives your attitudes about all sorts of gun relationships, and it's the strongest predictor by far. So I just illustrated that point with Jim, a student of mine. He was a military guy, and he's every day you could tell he's a military guy. He was a clean cut shirt, pants ironed, in a sea of undergraduates who don't do either, and so he sat up straight, and he was wide awake, again, unusual. And so he was a great guy in class, and I had mentioned some things about guns and gun control, and most undergraduates are for gun control, and he was not. And he related a story that I thought was pertinent to what we were talking about, is that when he married his wife, his in-laws told him, they knew he carried a gun, and they said, "We don't want you to bring the gun over to the house." And he, out of respect, he didn't do it. However, over time, they got to know Jim pretty well, and knowing Jim is liking Jim. He's just a likable guy. And over time, they, particularly when they went out and about around town, they invited Jim, and over time, they invited Jim to bring his gun when they felt unsafe. And the point is they didn't change their attitude at all toward a gun. They were still gun control advocates. They were still a little bit worried, but they trusted Jim, right? And so the point is how they felt toward Jim is what drove their attitudes toward the gun that Jim possessed. And that's true across the board. We do this with police officers. We allow them to carry guns. Most people have a fairly positive attitude in isolation toward police officers. But they have a very poor attitude toward gun owners, which is interesting, isn't it?
That seems contradictory.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's rationally the same thing. I had surveys out in the field, and I'd ask people on a scale from 0 to 100, 0 meaning you really dislike the person, 50 you're neutral, 100 you really like the person. How do you feel toward police officers? And it was around 65 was the average. How do you feel toward gun owners? Around 35. And NRA members, lower.
Well, I know atheists did really well in that measure.
They're down there with atheists. And so that's interesting, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
But if they did feel favorably toward these people, toward gun owners, they were more than happy to be more expressive and more liberal, if you will, in terms of gun control. Not liberal, loose gun control.
Yeah.
So Jim, I liked Jim. If Jim carried a concealed gun, you probably wouldn't think twice. Now, think about it in the opposite way, the counterfactual. Jim was stereotypically looking evil.
I don't like non-owners t-shirt.
he threatened the professor, and all the students hated him.
Yeah.
You don't want Jim to carry a gun. So your attitude toward all things regulation and gun regulation has much more to do with how you feel. And that's why what you guys said so important. The stereotypes that are out there of gun owners are huge. Yeah. There was a militia kind of a standoff in Michigan, the capital of Lansing, and they showed, the media, of course, showed the worst form of it, right? A guy carrying a gun, he stood over a police officer, and it looked like a movie.
Yeah.
There's thousands of other gun owners standing around that they look like me, right? See what I'm saying? We're just getting tricked.
Yeah.
Right.
There's more Jims than there are the evil person.
Well, and that's
You're creating a caricature.
yeah.
And you should have worn, you should have been you're in class and you should have done what your other professor guy you knew and worn a vest. That would've-
That story, yeah.
Those are hard to get, by the way. Just getting those vests is not easy.
Velcro.
they give those away, by the way.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
They're easy. Getting those vests
they
is
give
very
them away
easy.
if they've been damaged by bullets.
No way.
They can only use them once if they've been shot.
Yeah.
And
Interesting. I
what they
didn't know
do
that.
is they give them to, I know one of the places in California, special needs groups got them because certain in the autism spectrum, having a weight around you is a feeling of comfort, and they would give those vests. That's just an aside, but that's a.
The Kansas State Legislature passed a law that you could carry concealed weapon in class, and so now my syllabus it jots down the protocol, how that works. And some professors demonstrated against this, and one in particular, which he made a huge splash nationally. He walked into class with a bulletproof vest on, and making the statement that he's opposed to the Kansas legislature's law and reasoning, and as a result, he's going to protect himself. And I always thought, well, that goes to this point, at least tangentially. It means, who do you trust your students, right? Are they all gyms, or there's something out there? And I mean, just being someone in front of a class every day, you have to believe that they're all nice people. So
Yeah.
I didn't particularly like that demonstration, but it certainly made all the papers.
I mean, no offense. If I was one of the students in class, you think I'm going to take you out? I mean, obviously, the whole thing is not to shoot the mass, bud. It's to go after the targets that aren't blocked. So now I know.
Well, I'd have, if I was a student, I probably would have, whether I agree with him or not, it would have been funny to put on a pair of headphones and then had him question, why are you wearing the headphones? To protect me against what you're going to tell me.
Well, I would have just brought in one of those little straws and chewed on some paper and
Oh, yeah.
got him right in the side.
He'd probably pulled out the gun he had.
I'm just saying. I guess my point, what I think is interesting is you make a really, really good point about that because, and I talked about this with Beowulf on other episodes. We, as a society and as a culture, we derive a lot of our social quirks and viewpoints from things that just aren't real, which is really weird. I talked about in the last episode, I think it was literally last episode about dating. One of the rules that people refer to when contacting people on a side note of dating is the 3-day rule. That's made up. It's from romantic comedies. There's no credence of data. There's no reason. And so my whole point, thinking about this on a very roundabout way of talking about this subject, you look at something like the situation that happened in Lansing, and it's like, well, obviously that's the polarizing photo you want from a media conglomerate. This polarizing photo you want from someone who is anti-gun. But to the point we discussed a little bit ago, if you remove that photo and you create someone like Jim, then that's no longer a threat to anybody, and more people are likely to get involved.
More recently, it's the whole whipping the migrants.
Oh yeah,
right? The
yeah.
horse whip
Those
thing.
guys got in trouble.
They got in trouble, but
yeah.
guess what? They don't use horses anymore. Simply because that picture, which blew up all over the world, gave an image that they did not want to have. So they took away the ability to utilize that tool, those horses, to help stop that situation.
Now they're riding bulls.
No. Well, at least we're not using wolves yet. They use coyotes, though.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I don't necessarily know how I feel or what I think about that particular analogy with Jim, because I think you mentioned it. Well, you might have mentioned this. It might have just been me creating in a whole cloth. I think it's kind of disturbing in a way, because people are predicated more to make their decisions off of their observation of something as opposed to factual data. I think that could be a little disturbing, at least from my perspective.
Think about it this way. If everybody says, oh, they're dangerous this, they're dangerous that, and I don't disagree that the things have the potential of causing a huge amount of harm. That's what they're built to be used, right? But I always go back to the tool thing. And, Jim's in-laws, whether they agree, whether they think so or not, they believe it's a tool. And now that they knew it was in the hands of someone they believed in, now it's a safe tool. If it's in the hands of someone they don't believe in, a caricature, a stereotype, then it's the other way around. I mean, Isn't that how we all do
But
things?
in that respect, see, this is a problem, but it gives you some insight to the problem, is that it's almost impossible if you think along those lines, mass shootings, the violence we're talking about. If those aren't about guns, what the hell are we going to do, right? If they're about guns, we can legislate that.
Yeah.
The people in power can do something, look like they're doing something. If it's about a more complex thing, it's not just one variable, there's a whole array of things going on, then they're kind of moot.
Oh, you
They're
mean it's a hard problem?
It's a
I mean,
problem worth solving.
I mean, that's the
No, but-
that's the thing that drives me
there's-
freaking crazy.
that
There's
goes
no
back to
root
what
analysis.
We talked before we got on air. We talked about there's just some things that government's not well positioned to handle.
All things.
And
I'm sorry, some things.
One thing would be a complex problem that's not just, we can just instantly throw something down and regulate it. It's
But
clearly
that goes
a
back to
difficult
your
problem.
original premise, though, that if this was, I mean, this is, I know the word gun that is the central focus of this because of the ubiquity of them and the danger that it implies to have them and all that. But if it was really more nuanced than that, then study the hell out of it. Mm-hmm. That's what needs to be said, not just for the political situation, but this should have as much literature in academia as it
A space.
It should be a psychology course specifically aimed at the usage of weapons. I don't know if there even is such a thing. There's all kinds of stuff out there.
Well,
The most, in terms of these issues, sociology leads the way in terms of trying to understand gun culture. Second would be public health people are into this. And of course, they're in particular into this because they see guns as a public health issue.
Well, sure.
And so danger, violence, again, is the thing. So and then third is probably psychology, dispositions, and risk.
But public health is always an all or nothing situation.
Yeah.
The bigger point is that it is a complex problem, and every part of a university in terms of different disciplines should look at this, but they don't, because both the funding and both the disposition about the connection to violence is always there. It's a much more, we just identified, it's a more, just regulating guns is a multi-layered problem, and it's not just for one discipline to look at. It should be across many of them, and it's not. And until it is, we don't get to that point of agreement. There's got to be agreement amongst those who make recommendation for policy, agreement among politicians and the elites that we got to quit, playing games with this issue and get serious about it. And if you do that, you come to some sort of, balancing act. Not all or nothing. It's a balancing act. How far do we go? And where do we go? We don't always compare ourselves to Europe or anything. That's just a ridiculous comparison. We have to compare. We have to think about our own position and where we need to go. And until elites come to that position, we're helpless. We're just helpless.
Well, I'd love to end with something you said at the very end of your book. You stated, thoughtful people can possess modest, dispassionate attitudes about gun control. They can be tolerant of competing worldviews and advance sober practicality when it comes to public policy. The repeated vitriol directed at one side or the other ensures democratic failure. That is one lesson from the past several decades of gun politics. All things considered, sitting on the fence can be a reasonable position. Could we briefly dive into your thoughts about that particular statement in relation to gun control and current polarizing topics?
Yeah, I think we just spent some time on it. It's great you picked that out. I like that quote too.
That's a good quote.
Because whoever nowadays asks people to sit on the fence? Zero. No one does it. And that's the reason I wrote it, because it's a good position to be in. What it says is, as opposed to many people who you were talking about making the case for highly informed people rarely sit on the fence. They think they know the position going in. That's why I like people who sit on the fence that are often, they're honest with themselves. I can see this position. I can see that. I can. Why can't other people? Because there's a lot going on here, right? This is not a simple issue. We've talked about it just now. There's all sorts of different things going on. So let's sit on the fence for a while and listen and think about where we need to go with this, as opposed to a predetermined path. We're listening to somebody else who really doesn't know that much about it anyway. He's just trying to get our votes. And if we did that, if academics did that, if consultants and campaigns did that, and if elite journalists did that, we'd go much farther down a useful path. And we'd have far less violence, I think, as well. But we're not. We're not at all. I mean, think of the contradictions this society does. Hollywood blasts society for being violent, yet perpetuates the thing. Guns are in every movie ever made, yet, they say, let's control them. So, I mean, you have to widen the lens and say, well, this is not just about more access means more violence. It's a social society problem that we haven't even come close to addressing. The only way to address it is get off, sit back, and watch and see where we should go and what we should do, and hopefully support politicians who are doing a similar thing. Sit on the fence. Recognize, think about, you'll never see this, and I don't want to aggrandize this organization, but the NRA is a tremendous organization for special interests. But that's part of our Constitution. You have a right to band together and be represented, just as the AARP is a tremendous organization, just as the NAACP is. But one is tarnished in society and the other is not. What would happen if Democrats actually embraced part of that organization, the part that they could deal with? It would mess them up totally, right? It would create fissions and fractures. Why not, right? Sitting on the fence allows you to see things you never would see before. It allows you to get outside your dispositions and say, that might be possible. That might work. That's what this book is about. That most people that I deal with have never, ever thought about, in political behavior, never thought of gun owners as a group. It's startling how what? And then I show them this data. Wow, that's interesting. I never, really? No, it's really about partisanship, Joslyn. It's all about partisanship. It's really, what you're seeing in the data is gun owners are really Republicans, and that's what's splitting them up. And then I do all the modeling and statistical analysis and still show them, no. It's still, see, they're not sitting on the fence. They're unwilling to see something different. And so we're going to keep running down that path. And more millions of dollars are going to be underwritten for public health and for violence. And both are reasonable, but not reasonable in a larger context. We're not solving anything, right? Yeah. It's just all going the same way. So that's why at the end of the book, I wrote that. And one colleague, the guy who's quoted in the back of the book, he saw that correctly. And it's what it is just a plea to say, look, give it a shot. See what happens. We should give it a shot on many other issues too. Right? There's tons of issues in which we're not even close to being together on.
Yeah.
Right?
Seems like there's a divide for the sake of having a divide.
And you know what it is? We're being divided. It's not that we're divided. We're being divided. Our choices are this far apart. If they were this far apart, we'd make the choices. You could still choose Republican or Democrat, but they're close. They used to be closer. 1968 election, not a dime's worth of difference between candidates. That was the lament. Humphrey or Nixon, who gives a shit? They're the same, right? Are you kidding me? Who says that now? We're not polarized. Our choices are polarized. Think of the difference. We're not probably polarized on guns either. It's just that the politicians are making us choose between this and this. So don't willingly go for it. Sit on the fence and say, I don't agree with you. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm a gun rights person. I'm not saying I'm a gun control person, but I don't agree with you polarizing me, because that's what's going on. They're playing with us. They're dividing the pie in a particular way. Elections are all about winning, no other thing. And if I can get you and you to disagree and that makes me win,